Hello again, and I hope everybody's keeping safe and well, as always. This is our penultimate look at the EWWI worm bin. I'm going to do one more update after this video, and then that will bring the EWWI worm bin experiment to an end. So this is how the worm bin looked after the last feed of the ground up porridge oatmeal that I gave it. You can see it didn't cause the worms any problem at all, but you can predict, because the oatmeal is out of date, it is going to be a little bit on the acidic side, and it will get more acidic as it gets older and goes more out of date. So you can predict that's going to bring potworms into this bin eventually. Now what I'm going to do in this video is, and it sounds terrible to say it, but I'm actually going to try and induce protein poisoning, because I'm going to predict now it's not going to happen. And then I want to round up the EWWI worm bin in the next video, which will be the last video in the series, and I'll say a little bit more about what I think is really going on with things like protein poisoning and so on. So this is another feed of this out-of-date oatmeal, and what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to, over the next couple of weeks, put a very high protein, high carbohydrate feed into this bin. Now I can't remember the measurements off the top of my head, but I think this bin is something like 14 by 11 by 7 inches or something like that. So it isn't a very big bin. So what I'm doing is I'm just cutting some trenches in. I'm going to put the ground up oatmeal there, and then whatever's left I'm going to spread it across the surface. And then what I intend to do is leave that there for a week. And then I'm going to grossly overfeed this bin. And we'll see what happens. And I'm going to predict now a couple of things. There's going to be an explosion of potworms, because of the way the bin is going to be set up, and there's going to be no protein poisoning in the worms. So we'll see what happens. So I'm going to give this a little bit of time, and we'll come back, and then I'm going to do the major feed. So this is 6 days later. There's been a couple of bananas added in, and I'm going to be adding a lot more bananas now. Just to explain the bananas, I didn't buy them for this experiment, but I was a bit annoyed when I noticed that they were not nearly as bad as what the shopkeeper maintained they were. Our local grocer, our local shop I should say, sells fruit and veg, and if anything is going off a little bit, or not very cosmetically nice for sale on the shelves, he'll just give it to regular customers. So he asked me if I wanted some bananas, and in total I got about £5 of bananas. Now, in between times, a couple of days ago, I added a few of the bananas to this. I just wanted to have a look at them and see how they were doing. You can see they're doing really well. That it was quite a large feed of the porridge I put in. It hasn't affected them at all. And I put in a couple of bananas, which is far too early for them to be really doing anything at this stage. But what I'm going to do now is, the bin is very, very wet, as I mentioned, I think, in the last update. So I'm adding a layer, because I'm going to add a ton of really wet material to this. I'm adding a thin layer of cardboard, and you can see from the cardboard, I don't just use brown cardboard. Anything in the house that's made of cardboard, I pretty much tear up and chuck it in. Cereal boxes, tea bag boxes, yogurt carton boxes, the cardboard tray that they come in, anything like that. And obviously the usual things, kitchen, the inside rolls of kitchen roll and toilet roll and so on. So these are the bananas, and it's only when I went to go break them up that I realised they're actually, they look very bad on the outside, but inside they're perfectly fine. We could have eaten these, or we could have made banana cake or something like that. So once again, I want you to, at the very least, appreciate the sacrifices that we make to do these experiments for you. This is a beautiful potential banana cake. I could have had it with some yogurt, could have just eaten them straight, But no, they're being fed to the worms for this experiment, for your education, entertainment and delight. So anyhow, yeah, a thin layer of cardboard. There's going to be a layer of banana with the skins on. This is £5 of banana, well, a little over £5. I weighed them, plus the two I had in earlier. They were quite large ones. Probably £6 of bananas in total in a very small bin. This is what's left of the porridge oatmeal, and I'm just going to run these through the coffee grinder. And it doesn't look much there, but it was actually quite a bit. And remember, it's had 2 or 3 feeds already of this in the bedding. So within the bedding now, there's about 3 feeds of the porridge oats, which, as I mentioned, is out of date. So it is going to be slightly on the acidic side, which is why I'm predicting. Now, it won't turn the bedding acidic, but the overfeeding and the sort of moving towards the acidic side of things is going to almost guarantee an explosion in potworms, but we'll see what happens. Now, potworms in themselves they're not necessarily a problem till they get to the point where they're actually out competing the worms for food. These are scraps I was saving in a bucket outside, which was going to go into the garlic compost bin at the top of the garden. I don't know why that apple was there. It's just a bit on the spongy side. You can see we have eaten some bananas. There's tea bags, there's onion. This would have been frozen if I was doing this bin a couple of years ago, because there's no way that's going to break down. Well, it will break down, but it's going to break down over a very, very, very long period of time. And in fact, the turnip top, or the Swede top, is actually going to sprout at some point, I'm sure of it. So you've got the usual food scraps, tea bags, you've got some onion, there's lemon coming, you've got bread, just the usual mix of stuff, but it's very wet. And this was the remainder of the bucket, some bits of leftover dinner, same type of scraps. Now, there is a couple of eggshells in here, which I spotted, whole eggshells. And as I spotted them, I removed them. To be absolutely clear and candid, it's possible I may have missed 1 or 2 pieces of eggshell. A piece of eggshell whole in this bin at this stage is going to make absolutely no difference to the worms or to the pH of the bedding. But I just wanted to mention it, that I didn't realise there was some eggshells in there. But as I spotted them, I found them, and I think there was only 1 or 2 in total. So we have a layer of cardboard, quite a thick layer of the ground up out of date oats, and then quite a thick layer of very, very wet mixed scraps, including onions and lemon. It's very wet, and what I'm going to do, once I've just gone through looking for any remaining bits of eggshell, is I'm going to fill that to the top with the rest of the cardboard that I have. It'll go to the inner rim, and then I'm going to leave this for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm going to predict now that there'll be some springtails, there'll be an absolute explosion in potworms, there will be no protein poisoning, I'm not going to have any or many escapees, and the worms are going to absolutely thrive in this bin, because all of the information that's out there on protein poisoning, I think it's inaccurate and in some cases just blatantly wrong. And like I say, next month I'll do an update sometime in December, and then these worms will go on to a different experimental bin for 2022. But I'll just run through my thoughts, and keep in mind, I'm not scientifically trained. I'm not a qualified zoologist or biologist or anything else, but it's just some views I've come to based on a long time of observing and experimenting. So that's how it looks, and this is how it looks 3 weeks later. It's 20 days later to be exact. You can see that the levels have dropped. Sorry, I just want to check I'm still actually recording. Yeah, I am. You can see that the levels have dropped. Some fruit flies, but they didn't become a huge issue. I think the cardboard on the top did a good job on that. The cardboard is damp, so the capillary action of the fibres in the cardboard has drawn up a little bit of the moisture, which is good. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to slowly and thoroughly check every single part of this bin to see the vigour of the worms, see if they're healthy, see if they're what we understand as thriving, and see if we have any evidence at all of protein poisoning. So they did a good job composting down. You can see how much the level dropped. If you take a close look at that little handful there, you'll see all of the potworms. So yeah, it does look like we did have an explosion of potworms. Now normally, and it's good advice, it is correct advice, you will come across information which tells you that it's normally a sign that your bin is too acidic. This is true, but it's not always necessarily the case. You will get potworms in your bin even if the bedding is not acidic. If you have spots where you're slightly on the anaerobic side, there's a little bit of fermenting going on maybe, and the bin is overfed. That will bring in potworms into your bin. So although it is correct to say that your bin may be on the acidic side if you have especially a lot of potworms, having a few potworms is never an issue because you always will, even if you don't see them, they're there. But I think if you have a major explosion or a very large number of potworms in your bin, then you may need to look at either the way you're feeding, what you're feeding, or just check the acidity of the bin. That's a little piece of corn that's taking forever to break down. So all I'm doing is really just slowly revealing little bits of the bin to take a closer look at the worms. Potworms everywhere, as we expected. But you can see that the worms are doing really, really well. There's no issue whatsoever. And so far, no sign of protein poisoning. Like I said, I don't really want to get into it too much in this video. I want to sort of draw all the strings together for the final video, because this bin has been running for about a year now. It's been frozen. It's had vermin in it. It's been underfed. It's been overfed. It got way too hot. And I fed it everything I could in the wrong way to try and induce protein poisoning in the worms, and it didn't happen. And I did it because before anybody starts shouting about how could you put your worms at risk, I was 100% confident the worms were not going to get protein poisoning, because I've observed this before, and there is no sign of protein poisoning. So, like I said, you can see all the potworms there, incredible amount of potworms. But again, they're not at the point where they're now going to become a problem in this bin, although there's a lot of them. So after I've wrapped up this video, I'm just going to leave this bin for a couple of weeks, not do anything to it. We'll have one final look at it, and then I'll spoil the worms for Christmas. And then what I'll do is I'll start a new series next year, harvesting them. I'll harvest these worms and then set up a new bin from scratch, and we'll see how that goes. But I was 100% confident, based on all the previous observations I'd made with my own different bins and ways I feed the bins, that these worms were not going to get protein poisoning. And it convinces me that all of the information, or most of the information out there, is inaccurate, or just, like I say, completely wrong. I've never understood the argument. Why would a worm take in something and just sit on it and let it ferment in its inside until it blows itself up? Why would a worm, when it's able to move away from an environment that it doesn't like, why wouldn't it move away? That was another reason why this bin has always been open, is that at any point, if something is going wrong with the bin and the worms don't like it, they're always free to move. And there's lots of areas around where the bin is kept that the worms can safely move to. But I'm so pleased with this bin. I mean, the worm population has absolutely thrived with that massive last overfeed. And again, because of the inner dimensions of the bin and the amount of food and the 2 prior feeds of dry food, very high protein content, very high carbohydrate content, no sign of string of pearl protein poisoning. It's got a few different names, but I just knew the worms would be fine, and they are. So all I'm doing, like I say, is just systematically going around spot by spot, pulling out handfuls of worms just to show you they're all healthy. It doesn't matter where I look. It's always a good idea when you are checking your bin to check everywhere. It's one of the things that I've always done, especially after a feed, is to make sure that the worms are, unless you're pocket feeding. I mean, if you're pocket feeding, then of course you're going to draw the worms, or the majority of the worms, to that spot where the feed is. But I don't tend to pocket feed. I tend to spread the food out. So with that in mind, I want to see the worms working everywhere across the bin, which is why I'm just systematically going through it. Lots of adults, lots of juveniles, lots of babies, lots of cocoons. This really is, for the mess and the slop that we had 20 days ago, this is an incredibly healthy, in terms of the population, worm bin. Okay, I think I'm going to sort of wrap things up now. Really, this was just to show you right, let me phrase this correctly. I'm not saying overfeed your bin, and once again I have to put out the usual disclaimer because people will start shouting and ranting. I'm not saying deliberately break the rules. I'm not saying don't add ground up eggshells to your worm bin. I am not saying just willy-nilly overfeed your bin. It's not a problem. I'm not saying add a ton of acidic material to your bin like I did. The whole point of this series was to reassure particularly people new to composting with worms, or who don't have a huge amount of experience under their belt, that most of the things that you read about in books and on online forums and you see in videos that you may be tempted to worry about, you don't have to worry about them. This bin wasn't fed for absolutely ages. The worms were fine. The key thing was make sure they have plenty of bedding. This bin has been grotesquely overfed. The bin has been anyhow, I'm getting into what the next video is going to be about, so but you get the idea. If you've watched this far, thank you very much, but you for staying with it. But you if you're here, you get the idea. There's just a whole pile of things which it's so tempting for, like I say, new people or people with not a huge amount of experience to worry themselves sick about. I mean, when you read some of the posts on fora, people are getting incredibly worried. They're very passionate about their worms and vermicomposting, and they're incredibly worried, literally losing sleep. And the whole point of this series was to show you, honestly, the worms are an awful lot tougher than what you think. They will survive. As long as you've got a few key little things in place, they will manage absolutely fine. So, okay, this has gone to nearly 20 minutes. I think the original video was nearly 25 minutes in like the visuals. So I think instead of running it to the end of the visuals, I'm just going to wrap it up now. Say thank you very much for watching, as always. I hope everybody is managing to stay safe and well. The next video will be the last video in the EWWI worm bin series, and I'll wrap up all of the loose threads. I'll give you my thoughts on exactly what's going on with things like protein poisoning, and why really throughout this whole year the worms have been absolutely fine, despite the fact that for 12 months or more, absolutely everything you should not do with worms, according to the information that's out there, I've done it, and my worms were absolutely fine. Okay, I'll leave it there. As always, thanks for watching. Bye for now.